My hand was shaking so hard the coffee cup rattled against the saucer, and I set it down before I dropped it. Through the kitchen doorway, I could hear my mother's voice, low and fast, the way she used to talk when I was 17 and had missed curfew and she needed a story straight before my father got home. "Just say you were driving," she whispered. "He'll believe you. He always believes you." A car door slammed outside. Somewhere down the block, a siren was still winding down, that last low groan before silence. I stood in the hallway with my briefcase still in my hand, and I didn't move because for the first time in 11 years, I understood exactly what my family thought I was worth. Nothing. My name is Diane Marsh. I'm 44 years old and 3 years ago, I was confirmed by the United States Senate as a federal judge for the Eastern District. I earned it the long way, 9 years as a public defender making $52,000 a year in a city where rent alone was $1,800 a month, then a decade at a firm working 80-hour weeks to pay off $187,000 in law school debt. Then finally the appointment that changed everything, a lifetime seat on the federal bench, a salary of $232,600 a year, and a title that most people in my family had never once used out loud. 'Cause they didn't know. I never told my parents, Carol and Richard Marsh, what I actually did for a living. To them I was in law somewhere downtown. My younger sister, Ashley, 36, knew slightly more. Enough to know I had money, and that was the only fact about my career that ever seemed to interest her. I kept it quiet on purpose. In my family, success wasn't something you shared. It was something you got punished for. So for 11 years, I let them believe I was some anonymous attorney doing paperwork, while I quietly funded my parents' mortgage refinance, quietly paid off $14,000 of Ashley's credit card debt as a loan, and quietly sat at every holiday table pretending I didn't notice how the conversation always drifted away from me and back to her. I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need the recognition. I was wrong about how far that silence would let them go. It was a Tuesday in March when my mother called and asked me to come by, just for coffee, nothing serious. I should have known better. Carol Marsh does not do nothing serious. She does staging. When I walked in, Ashley was already at the kitchen table, wearing a blazer I didn't recognize, sharp-shouldered, expensive-looking, paired with a glass of white wine at 10 a.m., and my mother was pouring coffee with the too careful hands of someone rehearsing a script in her head. "Sit down, honey," Mom said, and the honey came out clipped, the way it does when she's already decided how the conversation is going to end. Ashley didn't look at me. She looked at her wine glass, turning the stem between two fingers, and said without any preamble at all, "So there was a small thing on Sycamore. Nothing major." I asked what small thing meant. My mother answered for her. "She clipped a man's car. He's saying his shoulder hurts, which is ridiculous. He was practically jogging around afterward." She said, "This the way you describe a parking ticket. But the officer's going to want a statement, and Ashley just had that DUI dismissed in January, so if this one goes on her record too, I could lose my license for good," Ashley said, finally looking up. "You know how that would look for the boutique." And there it was. Not concern for the man with the injured shoulder. Concern for optics. For a boutique that, as I would later learn, had never once turned a profit. My mother reached across the table and took my hand, the same gesture she'd used to comfort me exactly twice in my adult life, and said the sentence that would end up rearranging everything I thought I knew about my place in this family. "You weren't doing anything that day anyway. Just say you were driving." I didn't argue at the table. I've spent 2 decades learning that the moment you show your hand, people start managing you instead of talking to you. So I said I needed to think about it, finished my coffee, and drove straight to the county clerk's office instead of home. The incident report was public record within 48 hours. Case number, responding officer, witness statements. The man who was practically jogging around was 51 years old, and the report listed a suspected fractured clavicle. Ashley's blood alcohol hadn't been tested. She'd left the scene before officers arrived and returned 20 minutes later, claiming she'd been getting help. She hadn't been getting help. The gas station security footage, which I requested through a records request the following week, showed her sitting in her car in a parking lot 3 blocks away, on her phone for 19 minutes. I called her. I asked calmly why she'd left the scene. "God, Diane, you don't understand tort law," she said. A woman who had failed the LSAT twice. "There's something called contributory negligence, okay? If I'd stayed and started apologizing, that's basically an admission. And my insurance guy said never admit fault at the scene, it's like standard risk mitigation." She said risk mitigation, the way people say phrases they heard once on a podcast. I let her believe I bought it. "Okay," I said. "That makes sense." Then I hung up and requested the full 911 audio. The 911 call, logged at 4:52 p.m., was not Ashley's voice. It was my mother's. "Yes, hi, my daughter was just in an accident on Sycamore. She's a little shaken up. Is there any way to note that the other driver seemed to be the aggressor? He was already jaywalking." My mother, coaching a false narrative to a dispatcher, 90 seconds after impact, before anyone had even determined who was at fault. That was the moment I understood this wasn't panic. This was a family reflex. A well-worn groove. 2 weeks later, I stopped by my parents' house to drop off groceries. I did that every Sunday, another quiet thing they never thanked me for. And I heard my name through the cracked kitchen door before I stepped inside. "Diane won't even care," Ashley was saying, laughing. "She doesn't have a real personal life, she just works and hands out money. It's basically what she's for." My mother laughed too. "She'll grumble, but she'll say yes. She always says yes." I stood on the porch for a long moment before I knocked, and I made sure when I did that my knock sounded exactly like it always had. The final piece came from the boutique's own bank records, which Ashley had once, foolishly, given me limited access to as a co-signer on a small business loan I'd guaranteed for her 2 years earlier. The risk mitigation call to her insurance agent hadn't happened. There was no insurance agent. Ashley's policy had lapsed 4 months prior, unpaid because $30,000 of the boutique's operating capital had been withdrawn in cash over 6 weeks and had not gone toward inventory, payroll, or rent. She wasn't protecting a business. She was covering a hole that had nothing to do with the accident at all, and the accident had just become the excuse to make someone else, me, absorb the consequences of all of it. I made a decision that week, standing alone in my kitchen with the county's incident report printed and squared neatly on the counter. I was going to let them believe they'd won. I'd spent my whole career reading people who thought they were the smartest person in the room. The ones who talk themselves into trouble are the ones who feel safe. So I gave my family safety. I called my mother back and let my voice go smaller than usual, a half step higher, threaded with hesitation. "I don't know, Mom. I guess. If it just says I was driving and nobody checks." I let the sentence trail off the way people do when they're being talked into something rather than deciding it. I started showing up to family dinners in cardigans instead of the tailored blazers I wore to chambers, carrying a canvas tote instead of my briefcase, letting my mother interrupt me mid-sentence without correcting her. I let Ashley call me sweet but clueless to my face and simply blinked at her twice slowly, the exact expression I'd trained myself never to make on the bench. Inside, I was doing what I do every single working day, separating fact from performance and waiting for the record to build itself. They think confusion looks like weakness, I thought, driving home from that dinner. They've never had to sit across from someone who was pretending not to understand them. I have. For years. And I always knew. I set the bait on a Thursday. I told my mother I had found the paperwork the officer wanted, and that I was willing to sign a statement claiming I'd been driving, but that I wanted to get it right, and asked Ashley to walk me through exactly what happened, so I don't say anything wrong. I framed it as fragility. I framed it as a woman terrified of getting a story crossed. What I actually did was invite her to dinner at my house, seat her across from a centerpiece bowl with a small recorder inside it, and ask her on record to narrate in detail the sequence of events on Sycamore Street, including the timeline of the 911 call, the missing insurance, and the $30,000. My phone sat face down on the table beside my wine glass. It buzzed once halfway through dinner, a records office confirming the final piece of documentation I'd requested, the boutique's dissolved LLC status, filed by the state 2 months prior, a fact Ashley had told no one. I didn't flinch. I refilled her wine instead. She talked for 40 minutes. She told me everything, gift-wrapped in condescension, certain the whole time that she was managing an idiot. My parents hosted Easter dinner 3 weeks later. 14 people, my father's good tablecloth, the china that only comes out twice a year. Ashley arrived in a new dress. She'd clearly decided the case was closed, the lie was locked in, and I was a solved problem. We could have. 3 weeks ago, when you asked me to lie for you, I turned to my father. You've known me 44 years and never once asked what I actually do. Today's a good day to start. At that exact moment, because I'd made one phone call before dinner, to a colleague in the DS Victim Restitution Unit who'd been waiting on Ashley's case file for a statement anyway, my phone lit up on the table with a text confirming the injured man, whose name was Grant Feliz, had just filed a formal complaint citing the leaving the scene violation. I picked up the centerpiece bowl, the one that had held the recorder 3 weeks earlier, now empty, just glass and dried flowers, and I set it down hard enough that it cracked cleanly down the middle. That's the sound of a story breaking, I said. It happens whenever the truth catches up to it. Within 6 weeks, the consequences arrived in the flat, procedural language they always do. Ashley was charged with leaving the scene of an injury accident, a misdemeanor that carried up to a year in county jail. She pled to a lesser charge, received 90 days, most suspended, 5 years probation, and a permanently revoked license for 18 months. The DA's office separately opened an inquiry into the boutique's dissolved LLC and the missing $30,000, which by August had become a fraud investigation tied to a business partner who'd been quietly siphoning funds with Ashley's knowledge for over a year. My mother was never charged. False statement to a 911 dispatcher is notoriously hard to prosecute, but the recording I'd made was submitted as evidence in Ashley's case, and Carol Marsh's voice, coaching a fabricated narrative 90 seconds after impact, was read into open court. She has not spoken to a single one of her bridge club friends about it since, according to my father, who now calls me every Sunday. My father didn't get charged with anything either, because he hadn't done anything. He'd simply never asked. But something in him cracked open the way that bowl did. He started asking about my cases, my clerks, my life. 11 years of silence doesn't heal in 11 weeks, but it's starting. Grant Feliz, the man with the fractured clavicle, received full restitution for medical costs, $41,000, through Ashley's plea agreement, and I personally covered the difference between that figure and his actual 6 months of physical therapy, quietly, through a fund with no name attached to it. He never knew it was me. That wasn't the point. The boutique's 4 employees, who'd had nothing to do with any of it and had gone unpaid for their final 3 weeks of work when the business collapsed, received back pay within 10 days. I wired it myself, framed as a settlement from the dissolved LLC's remaining assets, though there weren't any. That part was mine. It was raining the night Ashley showed up at my door, 7 weeks after Easter. No umbrella. A duffel bag with what looked like whatever she grabbed fast. Her license still suspended, her savings gone to legal fees, the boutique's fraud investigation dragging her name through 2 local news segments. I have nowhere else to go, she said. Her mascara had given up somewhere around the porch steps. Please, Diane. You're the only one who has actual money. You always help. I stood in the doorway with the porch light throwing a small yellow circle around both of us, and I thought about the centerpiece bowl, and the wine I'd poured her while she talked for 40 minutes not knowing she was talking to a judge. I helped for 11 years, Ashley, I said. Without you ever knowing my name in a courtroom. You didn't want a sister. You wanted a bank with a pulse. I can't fix that for you tonight. And I'm not going to pretend that showing up in the rain undoes what you asked me to do at that kitchen table. So that's it? You're just done. I'm not angry anymore, I said, and meant it. That's different from being done pretending. I closed the door. Gently. No slam this time. The slam had already happened months ago and I didn't need to repeat it. My husband, Marcus, was in the kitchen when I came back in, 2 mugs of tea already made, because he'd been listening from the hallway and knew exactly how that conversation was going to end before I did. You good? He asked. I'm good, I said, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, that was the whole truth with nothing folded underneath it. Here's what I learned sitting on both sides of that table: the judge's bench and the family dinner table. Silence isn't peace, it's just debt collecting interest. If you let people believe they can spend your loyalty without ever knowing your worth, eventually they will, and they won't even feel bad about it because you never gave them a reason to. You don't owe anyone your credentials to be treated with respect. But you're allowed to stop protecting people who've never once tried to protect you. If someone in your life has ever asked you to shrink yourself to cover for them, to just say you were driving, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments what you did or what you wish you'd done. And if this story hit home like this video, subscribe for more. And I'll see you in the next one.